أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. One of the very important discussions on salah and prayer is making mistakes or errors or forgetting parts of salah. Many people think that the minute you make a mistake in your salah, you have to start over and your salah is invalid. But the Sharia, the religion of Islam, has given us steps to take when it comes to rectifying our salah. Most of the mistakes we make in salah can be rectified. We can salvage that prayer. And remember, prayer is a sacred conversation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's an act of worship. We cannot just cut it and invalidate it. So if there's a way that the Sharia has showed us to save that salah and rectify it, then we must take that option. We can't just break our salah and start over simply because we made a mistake. That's not how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to worship Him. Now, before we examine the types of mistakes that we make, it's important to understand that salah is an interconnected act, such that all parts work together to create that worship which we call salah. Because some people have an issue with this point. They're like, what if I made a mistake? So what? Doesn't God know that I have a good heart and I want to worship Him and my intention is right? So what's the big deal if I make a mistake here and there? Why should we get so technical with salah? Some people pose this objection. The spiritual dimension of our life resembles the physical dimension. In the physical dimension of this life, you have to get technical for things to work. In fact, the more advanced something is, the more functional it is, the more technical conditions it requires, right? I'll give you a very common example, daily example. Look at the Wi-Fi passwords and codes that we have. If you need to log in to a Wi-Fi internet connection, you have to put in the right code. If you goof with one letter, it's not going to work. Now you could sit there, get frustrated, and attack the company who invented Wi-Fi or the whole system and say, come on, don't they know I have a good intention? I really want to listen to that lecture. But I can't because I got one letter off. Or take the example of an airplane. You know, some airplanes have 6 million parts. 6 million parts. That's a lot. In order for the plane to function and fly, you need all parts working together. If there's a defect in one of the parts, if one part is not working, the plane is not going to fly. It's that simple. The same applies to salah. Salah is this spiritual, religious ritual which has interconnected parts. If those parts are observed properly, the salah will offer its effect. It will go into effect. If not, it doesn't. It's very simple. It's not because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to be technical and picky with it. That's how the system is. So the more we observe the conditions of salah, the more our salah will be accepted and the more it will be effective in our lives. On page 191 of the book, for those who just walked in, you can pick up the book from the table. Just write your name and last name, Assalamu alaikum, so we can keep track of who has the book. On page 191, the chapter is called As-Sahu. In Arabic, As-Sahu, the word Sahu, means to forget, to be oblivious to something. Something slips your mind, we call that Saha. He forgot, it slipped his mind. It also can refer to making mistakes. You forget and you goof and you make a mistake. That is also called sahu. So this chapter is dedicated to making mistakes in prayer. What type of mistakes do we have in salah, and how to salvage those mistakes, how to save the prayer. Now the general rule, based on what we said about salah having interconnected parts, the general rule is that whenever you make a mistake in salah and you forget a part, you forgot to recite Surah Al-Hamd, for instance, you forgot to say the dhikr in ruku', Subhana Rabbi al-Azim wa bihamdih. Whenever you forget something, what does the general logical rule state? Is your salah valid or invalid? If you write the Wi-Fi password but you goof with one letter, is it going to work or no? It's not. You need an override for it to work, but based on the general rule, it's not going to work. So the intellectual logical rule states, since salah has parts and they're interconnected, and salah has all these conditions, if you make a mistake with one single part, the general rule for your salah, is it to be valid or invalid? The general rule is for it to be invalid, because you did not observe the salah with its conditions. And whenever one condition is not met in anything, whether in the physical world or in the spiritual world, whenever one condition is not met, then that act becomes invalid. It doesn't work. Now, in order for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make salah easier for us, because we make mistakes, it's normal, we're humans and we make mistakes, we need an override. We need proof, evidence from Sharia, that if you make a mistake when it comes to certain parts and conditions, not all of them, some of them, then your salah is still valid. There's a way to fix that salah. Salvage that salah, rectify that salah. That's the override that we need. So do we have such an override when it comes to the salah? Or anytime you make any mistake, that's it. Your salah is invalid. We do actually have from Sharia specific evidence that tells us whenever you make a mistake in your salah, if your mistake follows under these categories that we will discuss, there is a way to save the salah. Let's examine these categories. This is now on page 192 of the book. Before we mention the mistakes, let's just be very clear that whenever you make a mistake in your salah deliberately, you deliberately not observe some parts of salah. You deliberately skip Surah Al-Hamd, skip a ruku', skip a sujood. What happens to your salah? It's invalid, because you did not observe the condition. And because it was done intentionally, deliberately, there is no override for you, there is no exception. Because the override that we have in Sharia is for those who made a mistake. They forgot, it was not deliberate. But if you deliberately add a single letter to your salah, a small part of salah, if you do that deliberately, your salah is automatically broken and it's invalid. That's very clear. And no override, no exception will be applicable to you. Having said that, let's examine the types of mistakes that we can make in salah, yet we can save that prayer. What are these types of mistakes? One type of mistake is for us to forget something. We'll discuss that. But one type of mistake is for us to not know something. There's a difference between knowing something but then you forget it and you make a mistake, and between jahl or ignorance. A lot of people, many years after praying, they realize, you know what? I was not aware of this condition in salah. I did not know that. I was clueless. This is a type of ignorance. Now, generally speaking, in Islamic law, generally speaking, ignorance is not excused. Why? Because you had the opportunity to know. Just like in our civil laws, in our laws of this country, is your ignorance excused? It's not. If you make a violation, then you get fined. You cannot defend yourself and say, I did not know, you're still liable to pay that fine by law. Yes, the judge can have mercy on you if you can really show that you have good intentions, but that's an override, right? That's an exception. But the law states everyone is accountable behind the law. Whether you knew or you didn't know, you had to learn. You're a responsible citizen in your society. You need to know the laws of your country. If you did not learn those laws, that's your problem. It's not the state's problem. We understand that very well in our society. Same applies to Sharia. On the day of judgment, that one hadith states, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will ask some people who had misconducts or did not fulfill their obligations. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will tell them, why didn't you offer those proper deeds? They would say, we did not know. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will tell them, هَلْ لَا تَعَلَّمْتَ? Why didn't you learn? So you could act. So ignorance really is not an excuse. Yet, Islam, because it's such a merciful religion, because our Sharia is merciful, it has given us that override in certain circumstances. Even though you were ignorant of something, even though you did not know about something, still, as long as your mistake does not involve certain parts of salah, there's a way to salvage that prayer. So we have to make, a distinction between forgetting something after knowing it and being ignorant of something. Islam is more lenient if you forget, because you made the effort to learn, you just simply forgot it. But it's more strict when it comes to not knowing and not learning from the beginning. So to give you just a few quick examples of where Islam has given us that override if you don't know something. For instance, we have al-jahr wal-ikhfat. This is applicable to men who pray. In 3 of our prayers, we have to recite with a voice, kind of loudly. In 2 of our prayers, Dhuhr and Asr, we have to recite silently, not using our voice. Let's say someone did not know this law. They were not aware of this. For years, he's been praying Salatul Subuh silently. Or he prays Dhuhr loudly. Suddenly, it comes to his attention that this is a condition in Salah. If it's the morning prayer, the Maghrib prayer, the Isha prayer, you have to recite loudly. If he did not know, he didn't observe that condition. So the general rule is for a salah to be invalid, but Islam has made an override over here. Even if you don't know, even if it's out of ignorance, that's fine. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will accept all those prayers that you offered because you did not know. Even though you should have learned, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here is making an exception. This is one example. And there are some other examples that we can also discuss later. For example, let's say you traveled and you were not aware that you had to shorten your salah, that the salah becomes qasr. Is this also an example? Scholars have discussed this. There is some disagreement here and there. What do we understand from hadith? But some scholars, like the author of this book, they are of the opinion that if you did not know you had to shorten your salah when you travel and you prayed full tamam, your salah is valid, even though you did not know this rule. So we have some exceptions. Now, let's examine also another point when you have a doubt about something. So the first type of errors is when you don't know something. The second type is you know something but you forget to observe it. The third type is if you have a doubt. These are the 3 types that we're going to address and discuss. We'll get to that in detail. Now on page 193, the author talks about as-sahwu anil arkan. Let's talk about forgetting and making a mistake when it comes to the pillar of salah. The salah has pillars. We call them arkan in Arabic. Rukn means pillar. If you make a mistake and you do not observe any of these pillars, your salah is automatically invalidated. Because these pillars represent the core of salah, the essence of salah. It's like a house that has foundations and pillars. If you remove one of the pillars, it's going to collapse. Now yes, with the decor, with some setup, with the walls, it's okay, if you tear that down, the house is not going to crumble. But the pillars are necessary. So when it comes to salah, it has pillars. If you make a mistake in any of these pillars, even if you did not know, you forgot about it, doesn't matter. The salah is invalidated. What are these pillars? The first one is niyyah, the intention. If you prayed and you forgot to do the intention, what happens? You forgot to make the intention. You were just so preoccupied, you just got up and prayed, and then suddenly in the middle of your salah, you're asking yourself, what am I doing? What salah is this? That reveals you did not have the proper intention. Salah is invalid. Because every religious act must have an intention. That's actually what gives value to our actions, because Allah does not want physical acts. It's the intention that counts. So if you ever forget to do the intention, that pillar is no longer there, your salah is invalid. Yes, if you know, as we discussed this last year, if you know what you're doing, you might be distracted a little bit, such that you're not fully conscious of your salah. But if somebody asks you, what exactly are you doing? You could say, I'm praying Salatul Dhuhr. If you have that much concentration, your salah is fine. But sometimes we're so distracted, we don't know. We just blank out. We have no clue what we're doing. You just forget, what am I even praying? Which salah am I even praying? If it's to that point, that reveals there's no intention. Now scholars have mentioned when it comes to the pillars of salah, if you subtract a pillar, meaning you forget to do it, or you add a pillar, the salah is invalidated. Now when you talk about the niyyah, it's clear how you can forget to do the proper niyyah, and that invalidates the salah. But let me ask you this question. Can you add an additional niyyah in your salah? Can you conceptualize that? Is that conceivable? Like the ruku', you could do 2 ruku', 3 ruku', 4 ruku's. You could add any number of ruku's. But when it comes to the niyyah, can you add niyyahs? No. That's why scholars have said when it comes to the niyyah, we cannot conceive like adding a niyyah. So the only way to invalidate your salah with the niyyah is not to have the niyyah. But it's not conceivable for you to add a second niyyah, a third niyyah. Yes, you could switch your niyyah, but that means you lost the first niyyah. So it goes back to the omission of that pillar. But we cannot conceive 2 niyyahs in one salah, the same niyyah twice. How does that happen? If you do the niyyah again, you're just reinforcing the first niyyah. You're not adding a second niyyah. Unlike the ruku', you could do 2 ruku's, you could do 3 ruku's, you could do 4 ruku's, right? So scholars have made this note. Any questions on that?
Does the niyyah has to be before salah right away?
The niyyah has to be a split second before the takbirah, such that when you do the takbirah, it is done with the niyyah.
So
if you did the takbirah and you still have not determined your niyyah, that's invalid.
So if I left my home, my intention is to pray Salat Dhuhr in the masjid. So I came to the masjid. And Allahu Akbar, I prayed.
See, that's a good example. If you left home coming to the masjid to pray Salatul Dhuhr, and as you're walking to Salatul Dhuhr, you just stand and say Allahu Akbar. See, you do have the niyyah.
Exactly.
The niyyah is not something that you have to verbally state. As long as you know what you're doing, that is niyyah. That counts as niyyah. And by the way, scholars have mentioned it's actually makruh. We said that last year. It's actually makruh right before you say Allahu Akbar after the iqamah, because when the iqamah is made, it's recommended to not talk anymore because you're almost like in salah. In fact, some scholars have said, you know what people do? Usalli salatul dhuhr qurbatan Allah ta'ala. It's fine, you can do that. If it helps you concentrate, do that. But scholars have said it's better not to. Don't add these words. Islam says, you know what you're doing, just say it. So the example that you gave, yes, that's a very good example. It's an example of you knowing what to do. That's the niyyah. The niyyah is not something that verbally you have to articulate or even something you have to tell your mind. As long as you're aware of what you're doing, then that reveals you have the niyyah. It's that simple. Yes.
Say, what if you walk into prayer late and you don't know whether they're praying Maghrib or Isha and you just go and say Allahu Akbar and you continue on?
If you go to Salat al-Jama'ah, you don't know what they're praying. Maghrib, Isha, Dhuhr, Asr. You don't have to know what they're praying. As long as they're praying a wajib Salah Jama'ah, you just make your intention and you join them. You do not have to know. We'll talk about this when we get to the rules of Jama'ah. You don't have to know what they're praying. That's not important. So your Salah is valid. So this is the niyyah. Anytime you don't have that niyyah, you don't know what you're doing, the Salah is invalid. The second one is interesting. Takbirat al-Ihram. If you start, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. You did not do the takbir of Ihram. Is your Salah valid? No. That Salah is not valid, no. In fact, once I saw in those questions that people post to the Maraji', one person had written, I've been praying for 20 years, and I did not know that the Salah has to start with the Allahu Akbar, with Takbirat al-Ihram. I would just start Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Because Takbirat al-Ihram is a pillar, and this person was not observing the pillar, even if they did not know, they're not excused. All those prayers are to be repeated, because that's a pillar of Salah. So anytime you skip Takbirat al-Ihram, it's as if you never entered Salah to begin with. Because the beginning of Salah starts with Allahu Akbar. Anytime that is not observed, you never really entered Salah. Salah is invalid. Cannot salvage it. What about adding an extra takbirah? Scholars have two opinions over here. Scholars of the past, it was their opinion that whenever you add a second takbirah, you've added a pillar. And the general rule is that if you subtract a pillar or add a pillar, what happens to your Salah? It's invalid. So if you said Allahu Akbar, and then seconds later, you said another takbirah with the intention of takbirat al-ihram, because we have the mustahab takbirat. We're not talking about that. The takbirat al-ihram. If you do a second takbirat al-ihram, you've invalidated your salah because you've added a pillar. So if you did that, you need to do a third takbirah to start over, right? The first one, you started your salah. When you did the second one, you invalidated your salah. So your salah just got broken. Now do a third one to start a new one. Some scholars today, some of the Maraji', they have a very valid objection, and let me know how you feel about this objection. They say we have an observation here, an objection to those early scholars. The early scholars, they've said two things which are not compatible with each other. The first one is that if you do a second takbirah, your salah is invalidated. That's the first thing they've said. The second thing, scholars of the past have said that whenever you make the niyyah, the intention, to stop your salah, the second you make such an intention, niyyatu qat' as-salah, you make the intention to stop your salah is automatically broken. Even if you didn't do anything. Even if you're still on the qibla, you didn't talk, you didn't break your wudu, the minute you tell yourself, I'm not praying, I'm stopping my salah, your salah is invalid. Previous scholars used to say that. Many maraji' today don't accept this opinion. They say if you don't act upon this niyyah, your salah is not broken. We don't have evidence from Sharia that your salah is broken. Let's say you're standing, you recited Surah Al-Hamd. After you said, غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ, somebody called you, something happened, and you're talking to yourself. Should I stop my salah? You know what, let me stop my salah and then I could pray later. Let's say you made that intention for a second. And then you changed your mind. You didn't do anything. You didn't talk to anyone. You didn't turn away from the qibla. A second later, you're like, you know what? Let me just continue my salah. Many maraji' today, they're like, your salah is valid. Just continue. You didn't invalidate your salah. You didn't talk. You didn't break your wudu. You didn't keep away from the qibla. So your salah is perfectly fine. Just continue. Whereas previous maraji' 1,000 years ago, what would they say? They're like, no, that's it. The minute you talk to yourself that way and you said, let me stop the salah, you've lost your intention. It's gone. Scholars today don't accept that. They're like, no, we don't have evidence from Sharia. It's strict to that point. Yes, the evidence that we have is if you make the niyyah to stop and you actually do something that invalidates the salah. As long as you don't act upon that niyyah, your salah is still salvaged. Just continue. So these are the two things previous scholars have said. One, if you do a second takbirah, salah is invalid. You need a third one. The second thing they've said, the minute you make the intention to stop your salah is invalid. Is this clear? The two things they've said? Yes, they have. So basically what they say, those early scholars, the number of takbirat al-ihram has to always be an odd number, because with the even number you break your salah. So you need an odd number to start a new one. They cancel each other, pretty much. So now these two things the scholars have said, are they compatible? Look at how our maraji analyze this. It's very nice and detailed. Are these two words compatible?
No.
Why not?
Because you add something, like you add another.
See, the maraji of the past, they're saying, the minute you make an intention to stop your salah is invalidated. And whenever you do a second takbirah, your salah is invalid, you have to bring a third one. Some scholars today are saying, there's a contradiction between these two statements. You can't keep them two. You cannot have these two opinions at the same time. You have to let go one of the other. Why?
Because they've already exited the prayer with just the intention, and the second, the even number.
Exactly. See, when you have done the first takbirah, Allahu Akbar, you entered your salah. Now you're going to do a second takbirah al-ihram. The minute you make the niyyah to do a second takbirat al-ihram, and adding a second pillar does what to the salah? It stops the salah. So haven't you made the niyyah to stop your salah? The minute you decide to do a second takbirah, have you not made the niyyah to stop your salah? Haven't you, based on what they say? Remember, they say, the minute you tell yourself, let me stop the salah, you've broken your salah. You can word it any way you want. Let's say someone says, right now, I am going to turn away from the qibla. You tell yourself. Then you've made the niyyah to what? Stop your salah. And previous scholars would say what? Whenever you make the niyyah to stop your salah, that's it, your salah is broken. So if you make the niyyah to do a second takbirah, when you make the decision to do a second takbirah, in reality, what have you made the niyyah for? To stop your salah. The second you did that, what happened to your salah? It got invalid. So the second takbirat al-ihram that you said is not invalidating your salah, because there is no salah anymore. You're out of your salah. So you just do a second one and start a new salah. No need for a third one. This is what our scholars are critiquing those previous scholars. They get very detailed in their arguments. Do you see the argument, or should I say it again?
Just the part where, so it can't be twice, it has to be three times.
Previous scholars are saying it has to be a third one to restart your salah. Scholars today are saying no.
So what do we do?
Well, we follow the marja whom we follow today, whatever he says. But I'm just walking you through the logic that they have used. To capture the argument one more time, scholars of the past, let's write this on the board to clarify it. Scholars of the past have said two things. One of them is that making the niyyah to stop your salah breaks the salah. Now, do scholars today accept this? No, many of them don't. They're like, as long as you don't act upon it, you don't actually do something, your salah is fine. But previous scholars, they would say this. This was their opinion. That's number one. Number two, they say, if you make a second takbirah, then your salah is what? Broken. So if you need to start your salah again, you need a third one. We need a third one, right? That's what they say. Scholars today are critiquing them. They're like, if you believe in number one, that the second you make the niyyah to stop your salah, the salah is broken. So now I'm praying, I did Allahu Akbar, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, or I have not even recited Surah Al-Hamd yet. Then I tell myself, I decide, let me make a second Takbirat al-Ihram. The minute I say that, what happened to my salah? According to scholars who believe in this first item.
You're outside of salah.
My salah is broken. Why? Because I need the niyyah to stop my salah. Now why did I make that niyyah? Because I made the niyyah to make a second Takbirat al-Ihram. And Takbirat al-Ihram is a pillar. And whenever you want to add a pillar to salah, what does it do to your salah? It invalidates the salah. So I made the niyyah to invalidate my salah by making the decision to bring a second takbirat al-ihram. So the minute I decide to do a second takbirah, I have already done what? Invalidated my salah. So am I now in salah or no?
No.
I'm not in salah anymore. So if I'm not in salah anymore, I want to start my salah, I just do how many more takbiras? Just one more. The second one. I just do the second takbirah and I start. I don't need to do a second one for it to invalidate my salah, so I need a third one to start a new one. Scholars today are saying that's not necessary. Because if you believe in number one, that's it. The minute you decided to do a second takbirah, you invalidated your salah. So you're not even in salah anymore. So you just start with another takbirah. Just do a second one. Yes, if you don't believe in number one and you say, no, just making the decision to make a second takbirah does not invalidate your salah. You have to actually do a second one, then yes, their opinion is now valid. Their fatwa is valid. Because you have to do a second takbirat al-ihram. Now that you actually did the second takbirah, then your salah got invalidated, so you need a third one to start. So that's their critique of early scholars. Is this clear? Do you accept this critique, or you side with those early scholars? Do you see it a valid critique or no?
The second scholars make more sense.
Yeah, it's very meticulous and detailed, but that's what Islamic law is. It's very, very detailed. Scholars actually examine these pieces of evidence and they become very logical and rational with it. Sometimes it's like calculus and math where you're looking at very delicate equations here. So they're like, those two don't add up. Either, don't believe in item number one or number two, but you can't combine between the two. So this is a critique that modern scholars have when it comes to the fatwa of those early scholars. Yes, brother.
Now, what if I don't bring a second takbirah, and if I just bring one of the factors that makes it mubtil? Like, let's say I move away from the qibla and I start walking away.
Your salah is invalidated.
Okay. So then in that case, I don't need to bring a second takbirah?
No. That's obvious because you have done something else to break your salah. Over here, we're simply discussing breaking your salah with a second takbirah. Does that break the salah or no? So this is, yes.
I have a question that confused me because I was in Chicago, that's why I didn't come here. My mom had surgery, I told you last week. So I was sitting with her, but I was praying Asr there. Is that okay? Because I stayed there actually 8 days.
As long as you stay somewhere less than 10 full days, even if it's 9 days and 18 hours. 9 days and 23 hours and 50 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
As long as it's under 10 days, you pray qasr.
Okay, but why did they tell me? Because I lived there all my life in that house, since I was young, that I don't have to pray Asr. Is that true?
If you lived in Chicago, such that Chicago was your hometown,
Yes.
when you left Chicago and you moved to another state, with what intention did you and your family move? Did you move with the intention that Chicago is no longer my hometown?
Yes. Because
Or no?
my husband got married, we moved here.
So you made the intention that Chicago is no longer my hometown.
just-
So you pray qasr there.
Okay, okay.
You pray qasr there, yes. So we talked about the niyyah, we talked about takbirat al-ihram, and then we also have the qiyam as the third pillar. When you're doing takbirat al-ihram And right before you go to ruku', you have to be standing. If you're able, of course, you have to be standing. If someone forgot, they simply forgot to stand while doing the takbirat al-ihram. They were sitting and they did the takbirah. They were sitting and they did the ruku'. They forgot. So they missed this pillar, which is standing, al-qiyam, حال تكبيرة الإحرام, والقيام المتصل بالركوع. The qiyam, the standing while doing the takbirah, and the qiyam, the standing that precedes the ruku' immediately. If you forget to observe this, what happens to your salah?
Invalid.
It's invalid. Even if you forgot, because this is a pillar of salah. What about the qiyam, the standing in between the takbirah and the ruku'? Let's say when you're saying غير المغضوب عليهم, you accidentally sat down. You just forgot. For whatever reason you sat down, but not intentionally, of course. Did you miss a pillar of salah? No, you did not. Why? Because we said only which qiyam, which standing is a pillar in salah? The qiyam that you have to observe while saying Allahu Akbar. That's a pillar. That standing is a pillar. And also the qiyam that comes right before what? The ruku'. When you go to ruku', you have to be standing and you go to ruku'. These two are the pillar parts of standing. As for the other parts of standing, when you're reciting Surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad, Surah Al-Hamd, it's a part of salah, you have to observe it. But if you forgot to, you simply forgot to. You got distracted, you forgot. Did you miss a pillar? No, you did not miss a pillar. For that qiyam, that's between the takbirah and between the ruku'. So if you subtract this qiyam in the beginning of salah while during the takbirah or before the ruku', your salah is invalid. Otherwise, there's a way to salvage it. Question. We talked about omitting this qiyam, the pillar. Can you add this pillar? Like the ruku' and the sujood, can you add a qiyam during takbirah or right before ruku'? Is it possible? Is it conceivable?
I was about to ask, how does it look like?
It is only conceivable if you add a second takbirah with it, right? But you can't give a standalone qiyam without the takbirah, right? You could add a second qiyam like that if you add another ruku'. You go to ruku' again. That's why scholars have said it's inconceivable to add the pillar of qiyam on itself. It's inconceivable. Because even if you sat after takbirat al-ihram and then you stood up again, you made two qiyams, okay. You have not added a pillar. Because which qiyam is a pillar? The qiyam that is concurrent with the takbirah. So it's impossible to bring such a qiyam without bringing a new takbirah. So if you brought a new takbirah, it goes back to our earlier discussion of the takbirah itself. So just keep that in mind. That you can omit this qiyam, but you can't add another qiyam of this sort. You could sit down and do takbirat al-ihram. You've omitted this qiyam, which is a pillar. And that invalidates the salah. So we have the niyyah, we have takbirat al-ihram, we have the standing. And then we have the ruku' and the two sujoods. Whenever you skip a ruku', you skip it entirely in a rak'ah. In the third rak'ah, you forgot to do the ruku'. You know, when you finish Surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad, you went straight down to sujood. What happens to your salah? Salah is invalidated. Whenever you skip two sajdas, not one. If you skip one, you have not abandoned the pillar. We'll talk about it. But if you skip two sajdas, what happened to your salah? Invalid. Let's now talk about adding these pillars. If you add a ruku', in your second rak'ah you did two ruku's. Let's say you prayed. After you prayed, it was brought to your attention that, you know what, you did two ruku's. You bowed twice in your second rak'ah. What happens to that salah? Invalid. That salah is invalid. Why? Because adding a pillar, which is the ruku', invalidates the salah. Just like omitting it invalidates the salah. What about the two sajdas? See, the two sajdas together make up the pillar. So if you forget one sajda, you still have the pillar. If you add one sajda only, meaning you did 3 sajdas, is your salah invalid? No, you have not added a pillar yet. How many additional sajdas do you need to make for you to add a pillar? 2. So that means if you did 4 sajdas in one unit, then you've invalidated your salah. But if you've done 3, there's a way to salvage your salah. Your salah is not automatically broken. This is what we'll discuss next. If you do these mistakes, what do you have to do? Some types of mistakes, you don't do anything. Just continue. Some types of mistakes, you have to go back a little bit and fix them. Some types of mistakes, after salah, you have to do what? Sajdatay as-sahu. We'll examine that. So this is something that we will examine in detail, inshallah. Now, all of these details that we're talking about, where are they coming from? From the hadith. Hadith of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, some of them from the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. These overrides come from the Imams of Ahlul Bayt as they explain to us the Sharia. Now, the author actually brings us the text of these hadiths. You know, if you make a mistake in your ruku' and your sujood and the qiyam, what happens? What's our evidence? It's all found in our book, you know, from page 192 to 195, 196. The author actually gives us the very text of these hadiths. Some of them we'll mention on Wednesday, inshallah. We'll examine some of these hadiths so we can be familiar with the wording of the Imam and with the ahadith that we have from Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon them. To give you a quick example about Takbirat al-Ihram. If you forget to do Takbirat al-Ihram, why is your salah invalid? We have a hadith in which the Imam alayhi salam was asked, this is on page 194, the 5th or 6th line. سئل الإمام عليه السلام عن الرجل ينسى أن يفتتح الصلاة. The Imam was asked about a person who forgot to start his salah with Takbirat al-Ihram حتى يكبر. The Imam alayhi salam says يعيد الصلاة. The Imam says he has to repeat the prayer. What does that mean? When the Imam says you have to repeat the prayer, that means takbirah is a pillar in salah. He forgot to do it. He didn't do it deliberately. The Imam says you have to repeat it. You missed a pillar. So this is one hadith that our maraja and scholars will cite in issuing their fatwa. So that's an example. For the qiyam, we have a hadith from the Imam alayhi salam in which he says, إِنَّ مَنْ وَجَبَتْ عَلَيْهِ الصَّلَاةُ مِنْ قِيَامٍ. The one who has to pray while standing, meaning you're able, you're not sick, you're not disabled, you can stand and do it. حَتَّى افْتَتَحَ الصَّلَاةَ وَهُوَ قَاعِدٌ. He started his salah with the takbirah while sitting down. حَتَّى افْتَتَحَ الصَّلَاةَ وَهُوَ قَاعِدٌ. The Imam alayhi salam said, عَلَيْهِ أَنْ يَقْطَعَ الصَّلَاةَ. He has to what? Stop his salah. His salah is broken. Why? Because he did not observe a pillar of salah, which is to stand while doing takbirat al-ihram. The Imam says, the salah is over. Let him just cut his salah. وَيَفْتَتِحُ الصَّلَاةَ وَهُوَ قَائِمٌ. He needs to redo the takbirah while standing. So we have, you know, these ahadith from the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, which are the proofs for many of these rulings. So remember, our scholars actually have to examine every hadith here. And they look at the chain of narrators. Who narrates this hadith? Are they reliable narrators? Are they found in reliable sources? So every fatwa that you see in the book of rulings, really tens and hundreds of hours of research the scholars have done. We should really appreciate the effort that they make. And I gave you an example of how meticulous sometimes they are with each other's fatwa, right? So these scholars today are looking at something scholars have said 1,000 years ago, and they're like, wait a minute, there's an embedded contradiction here. You can't have these opinions. We need to take a closer look, and that's why they've issued a modified fatwa. So this is very, very meticulous. So next, inshallah, we'll examine what to do when we make some of these mistakes. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطاهرين.